This episode of The Bill and Callie Show is brought to you by Tiger Plumbing. Whether you need to replace a faucet, overhaul your sump pump, or desludge your drains, call Tiger Plumbing. In today's world, knowing who's at your door is important. Tiger Plumbing sends you your technician's photo, estimated time of arrival, and a little bit about him or her. Hey, Sam likes fishing and camping. Cool.
Well, hi, everybody. I am so extremely excited today about who our guest is. And I'm going to preface this a little bit with Bill and I were in Valparaiso for the AM Valpo Chamber of Commerce meeting, which was at the Barnes & Noble. And I was standing there next to this section of books about Indiana, and I saw this book called The Burger Chef Murders in Indiana. Now, my two girlfriends that I call my sisters, we call ourselves the Nancy Drew Crew because we are obsessed with true crime and forensic files and serial killers and everything. And I saw that book and I had to get one. And I read it and I fell in love with Julie, who is the author, Julie Young. And also because this is a true crime case that happened in 1979, and I absolutely remember when it happened. I didn't feel as close a connection because it was way down in Speedway, Indiana, and I lived way up here in Northwest Indiana, but I was the same age about as the manager that night. And I was so excited to get Julie on to talk about this book and some of her other books. Julie, welcome to our show.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
And Julie Young, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you became a writer and where you live and all that good stuff?
Well, I'm Julie Young. I live in the Indianapolis area, and I became a writer because that rock star thing didn't work out. That is always my go-to answer.
We're right there with you.
I grew up believing that I was going to be a rock star, bigger than the Beatles, and so far, my big musical claim to fame is that I was at Elvis's last concert. So that's pretty much it. But at any rate, no. But, you know, what started out as thinking I was going to go into songwriting and performing eventually became writing. And, you know, it's same thing, just different business. It just looks different.
That's very true. Now, you are a multi-award nominated author, and you have, 8 books, or is it more than that now?
I think I'm up to 13. I think I'm up to 13. Beginning to lose count, which is a good problem.
And you are also an award-winning freelance writer.
Yes.
And you are a rock star because I read in your bio that you were on the Oprah Winfrey Show at one time.
Yes, I was back in 2000. Yes, that is true.
So see, that makes you a rock star no matter what.
Hey, I'll take it.
So this book, like I said, my girlfriends and I call ourselves the Nancy Drew Crew. We're totally obsessed with things. And I saw this book and I read it, and it's so heartbreaking.
Yes.
And were you living in the area back at the time when this happened? Were you down in the Indianapolis area?
Yes. And I have to preface this by saying you mentioned that it happened in 1979. It was actually 1978.
Oh, okay.
So I was all of 6 years old. And so I was very little. And my connection to it really has nothing to do with the individuals themselves, but I was a big Burger Chef fan. That was my favorite restaurant as a kid.
Sure.
I even kind of mentioned in the introduction that, you know, it was the only place where you could get Star Wars stuff when the original Star Wars movie came out. So, you know, I had the poster that you could get with a large Coke, you know, and, you know, that was a big deal because the merchandising for that franchise hadn't, you know, gone great guns yet. So that was the only place you could get Burger or Star Wars stuff was at Burger Chef. So it was, you know, itself. But then over the years, you know, every few years they would write something in the newspaper about the murders. You know, anytime there was a 5th or 10th year anniversary, something of this nature. So that's kind of how I familiarized myself with the case. and I kind of lost track of it for a long time. And at some point, I was actually researching another book of mine when I discovered that they found the kids on the or they reported them missing. There was like a connection to the date that Jim Jones and company drank the Kool-Aid in Guyana.
Okay.
And it occurred to me what I didn't know about the case, more of the historical context, what all had been going on in Speedway at that time. I lived on the other side of town, and obviously being so young, I certainly would not have remembered, the actual event. But realizing that over the years, if you're only getting the basic recap of the story, you're not getting a full picture of what really happened. So I knew going into it, if they could not solve the mystery in 40 years, I wasn't going to do it in 2, and it wasn't my intention to try. I felt that it would be doing a disservice to all of the hardworking law enforcement officers who dedicated so much time to the case. I felt like it would pour salt into the wound of the families, involved. And it was more my intention to make sure nobody ever forgot the victims. And that, by putting it in a historical context, we can hopefully learn something from it. And more importantly, also recognize how, no matter how good technology gets, these things can still happen.
Right. So did you get to interview any of the family members or friends and things?
I interviewed one gal who went to school with Jane Freed. I happened to have a friend who I did not know had attended high school with her, so I got a little bit of an insight from her. But honestly, I really felt like, well, first off, I should say a lot of the parents are deceased, and because I was really trying to do it from a historical perspective rather than exploit emotions, I really wanted to stick to the known newspaper articles of it, because again, and also that would help avoid any going into like conspiracy theories or chasing things down rabbit holes that didn't need to be chased down.
Okay. Kind of go into a little bit of detail for anybody who's not familiar with this, kind of what happened on that day.
On the Friday evening before Thanksgiving in 1978, there were 4 Burger Chef crew members cleaning up the restaurant at the close of their shift. Around a little after midnight, another employee who had not worked that evening showed up, saw that the lights were still on, decided to go in and help his friends. And when he got there, he noticed that the back door was ajar. He went in and nobody was there. There were cash register drawers laying on the floor. The manager's office looked like it had been ransacked. And he noticed that the girls' purses and jackets were still on the premises. Now, knowing most girls don't leave their purses and jackets behind, he called the police. And the manager showed up, the police showed up, and their first instinct, and after totaling up the receipts from the cash registers, they kind of concluded that about $600 in cash was missing. But there were still several $100s of change rolled up and still in the safe. And for some reason, they all kind of concluded that maybe the crew members themselves took the money and went out for pizza or something, or, went out for a night on the town. Several hours went by and the employees never showed back up. Finally, they started looking around and they found the assistant manager's car parked a few blocks away, but no sign of the kids. And at that point, they thought something had gone wrong, that perhaps there was a kidnapping, and they started looking for them. Well, that would have been early Saturday morning, and it took until the following afternoon for their remains to be discovered by a couple in a very wooded property in another county.
Yeah.
And so that was more or less the setup as far as the crime itself and the discovery of the body or the bodies. At some point, a couple of teenagers came forward and said that they had seen 2 men behind the restaurant on the night of the disappearance who had kind of asked them what they were doing there and kind of hurried them along, and they left. And they reported that one of the men had darker hair, had a beard. One man was clean shaven, had a little bit lighter hair. and they made composite drawings of these two men, and they never came forward to say they were the guys behind the Burger Chef. And of course, at that time, even though the composite drawings look pretty good, you have to realize they are composite drawings.
Sure.
And stop and think about what everybody looked like in 1978. Everybody knew somebody who looked like these two guys.
Oh, of course.
And so, there were tons of leads, but they didn't go anywhere. And the case went cold fairly quickly. In the mid 80s, a gentleman came forward who was already had a rather long, extensive history as a guest of the state, if you will, and kind of suggested that he had something to do with it, or that he was involved but wasn't guilty of murdering them. And around it went. And eventually he confessed, but then recanted right after he confessed. And nobody could prove whether or not he really had anything to do with the murders or not. He already was serving like a 99-year prison sentence anyway, so maybe It wasn't worth taking him before a grand jury. So basically, there have been very few developments in it. It's still about as cold as it ever was. There were a lot of mistakes made, and to play fair, mistakes are made in every police investigation.
Sure, absolutely.
We are humans after all. So there is something to be said for, the fact that some of the mistakes were honest and could have happened to anybody. There was also the problem with the fact that you had, the primary crime scene being the disappearance at the restaurant, but then the bodies being found in another county. This creates kind of a problem when you have different agencies controlling two very different, crime scenes. So it was a very interesting case. It was very interesting to look into it. Also of note is that it came on the heels of two other major crimes in the same area that happened within a few months of each other. And then on top of it, you have these kids missing and murdered, Right. So that's why I thought it was a really fascinating thing to look at from a historical point of view, because otherwise, you may know what happened, you may know what didn't happen, you may know that it went cold, but you don't know everything. There's always a little more to it. Yeah.
Right. Well, I know I was really frustrated, and I don't want to badmouth the police department there, because I know, first of all, it was a different time.
Yes.
The way people did things, and their thought was these were just for, nice kids. Maybe they just kind of decided to get a little wild one night and go out and do everything. But it drove me crazy that there were no photos taken of the crime scene and no fingerprinting done. That they let the morning crew come in
and clean the place,
just get ready to open the restaurant. And
so they let the crime scene get disassembled. They cleaned up the crime scene, disassembled gosh, now they keep the old tape up for days if they have to.
Right.
Well, and you pick up on the same thing that I thought. You can't judge something that happened in 1978 by 2019 standards or 2020 standards.
Absolutely.
And another thing that's important to remember is back then, they didn't presume kidnapping right away. I mean, I remember the mid 80s before we started looking at immediacy in terms of looking for kids that were gone, I don't know what the exact rules were, but I know it was probably at least 24 hours, And you're talking teenagers. You're not talking about a little kid that you either know has been taken or hasn't,
Right.
So you have, a bunch of teenagers who are old enough to drive, and apparently it wasn't all that unusual for people to step out and go get donuts or go get a pizza, and I believe there was an under 21 club nearby, that they kind of said, oh, it's not unusual, so it's like things that if you look at it from today's standards, you would say that's weird. We would never let that happen now. The one thing that jumped out at me, though, more than anything else, and again, because I really try to refrain from any kind of speculation regarding the case, is that for all intents and purposes, the manager described these kids as having never been late to work, always being model employees. So there was a part of me that thought, if these are model employees, why would you think they took the money?
Right.
That's what didn't add up to me. But I also know that sometimes maybe managers know a little bit more about kids than they let on. My brother used to work in fast food, and I know there were a lot of parties that happened that I'm pretty sure the managers would never have told my mom and dad about, And I'm not saying that's the case. I'm just saying
no.
That strikes me as strange that you go from saying, here's these model employees to maybe they took the money. Those two things don't go together, in my opinion. So that's the only thing that jumped out at me is if you thought they were such good employees, why would you think they would take the money? Why wouldn't that spawn I know they wouldn't take in the money. Let's move this forward a little bit. Let's not presume it's them. Because I think that's where maybe valuable time went missing, in terms of possibly finding them.
Right. Now, there were the 4 employees. When they were found, 3 of them had been shot. But
2 of them were shot. 2 of them were shot execution style. 1 was stabbed.
That's right.
And 1 looked to be beaten. And that remained kind of questionable for a long time. Or people weren't sure what had happened. Was he beaten and left for dead? And did that cause them to have to get rid of the other 3? Did he run into a tree? And fall in such a way that he ended up suffocating on his own blood. We just simply don't know. There was somebody who suggested that they may have seen something involving this individual, in the Burger Chef parking lot on the night of, but really, I don't know.
Right.
I suspect that if you're running and you aren't familiar with the woods, if you're watching behind you and in front of you, you might have hit a tree. I don't know. But I guess, and that was another thing that jumped out at me. It wasn't a very well-planned murder, which suggested to me they weren't planning murder at all. Maybe, because if you were, you bring enough bullets for everybody, and I don't mean to be harsh when I say that.
Oh, no.
But it's just, if that's what the goal was, there would have been a much easier way to handle that. And obviously that didn't happen, which begs the question, if they weren't planning to murder somebody, how did it get there? How did it happen that that's what the end result was? And I think the best speculation that the cops created was the fact that perhaps somebody recognized somebody, and this turns whatever the plan was on its ear and results in, and unfortunately, a quadruple homicide.
Right. What I also enjoyed about the book, of course, being a true crime kind of person anyway, but at the end of the book, you also talk about some other, shut up. You also talk about some other unsolved cases here in the state of Indiana, including Libby and Abby from Delphi, who it's only been about 2 years since their murders. And just so sad.
Well, and that's what, I very quickly realized the book was not going to have a happy ending. There wasn't going to be this aha moment. And so I was really kind of torn about, what do you do with this? When you just say, okay, here it is, this is what happened and we don't know. That didn't seem very satisfying to me. So that's when I thought, what can we learn from it? Are there other cases that resemble it in some ways? And that's what made me start looking at some of these other cases. And a friend of mine had told me about Denise Flum, who had gone to a party one night, left her purse behind, went back to pick it up and never came back home.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that was in the 80s. I mean, it just breaks my heart to think, when they say she was last seen wearing acid wash jeans and a Motley Crue shirt, if that isn't just totally 80s, I don't know what is, what is. And she had no reason to run away from home, and she's never been found. We don't know what happened to her.
Right.
something like Lauren Spear, where all those cameras around Bloomington, and somehow or another, what happened to her falls into this weird blind spot and nobody knows. And as well publicized as that case has been, we still don't have any answers. So like the Burger Chef murders, it's not something that we didn't know about. Definitely it was publicized. And then Libby and Abby, it's seemingly so random, that they just happen to go for a walk. They get that one shot of the guy, or who we believe to be the guy.
We've got his voice and everything,
Yeah, and yet it's still not enough. I
Right.
mean, that's the big thing is look at all the technology, look how far we've come, but it's still not enough.
Right.
And that's where if the book does anything, I want it to show people, yes, mistakes can happen, and yes, we can make great advances in technology and forensics, but at the same time, you can't ever stop being vigilant. You can't ever presume that somebody isn't going to get lucky. And, there really is no such thing as the perfect crime, but there is just the perfect opportunity and the perfect setup and the perfect mistakes that it can be the difference between solving something and a cold case lasting 40 some odd years.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, okay, now that we've totally depressed ourselves, let's talk about some of your other books. Let's talk about some of the other cool things that you've done.
Well, I always say I'm never attached to one genre or another. Although I do typically do a lot of local history. I have done a young adult novel about a rock star, surprise. And I've written 2 books for the Idiot's Guide series as well. So it's always something. I never know what I'm going to find myself in the middle of, but I think just having a curious mind leads me in a lot of different directions. So that's not a bad thing.
Not at all. So for our listeners and our viewers right now, tell them how they can find your books, how they can find out more about you and the things that you're up to and all of that good stuff.
Well, obviously I'm on Facebook, Twitter. I don't do a lot of tweets, so I have to admit, my website, julieyoungfreelance.com. And I would say right now, support your local bookseller. Obviously we are coming to you live from quarantine, basically. So it's very important that people, support their local booksellers that typically, keep my books on stock. If you're home and you need a read, yes, it's available in digital on all the normal platforms. But I would say absolutely, if you've got an independent bookseller, without a doubt, support them. They need you. They need readers.
Yeah.
And they do a fantastic job of being in the know on, because independent booksellers are at their heart readers to begin with. So
Yeah. Absolutely. Julie, I cannot thank you enough for doing this. When I reached out to you, I never even thought I'd hear back from you because to me, you are a rock star.
Oh, well,
Anybody who can and do what you do. I've been trying to write a book about my own life and I don't even know where to start. And that somebody can sit there and write all these books and be award nominated and award winning freelancing and everything like that. To me, you are absolutely a rock star. And I appreciate you so much. And thank you so much for coming on our show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Definitely.
We
Thank
really
you.
appreciate it.
Yeah, we always appreciate authors and their dedication to their craft. It's amazing because so far my autobiography is fitting on a index card. So, yeah.
Well, notice I haven't written my own autobiography, and I will tell you, after having helped somebody write their biography, don't ever finish it because the gentleman actually passed away not long after we finished the manuscript. So, new rule: don't ever finish your autobiography.
Right. There you go.
Yeah. Oh boy. Well, we better wrap things up here pretty soon.
Absolutely.
But yeah, it's. But boy, we can't tell you how much we appreciate it. And this is we're trying to provide entertainment for people who are trapped inside and going stir crazy. And yeah. And now, where are you located again, Julie?
I'm in Indianapolis.
Indianapolis. Okay. Yeah. So we're all under the same stay at home.
It's in quarantine.
Yeah.
It doesn't bother me because it doesn't bother me as much as some people. But then again, I work from home, so this is it's not all that different for me, you know.
Yeah.
So
Right. So before we let you go, because you are from Marion County, and that is one of the most that it's leading the number of infections right now tested. So what is life like down in Indianapolis? Have you ventured out to go to the grocery store? I mean, what is
sure. You know, you make sure you get to the grocery store early to get at least, you know, some meat and, you know, and your quantity of milk, you know, products. It's not that bad. I mean, but then again, I mean, yes, I've gone out, but people have been very polite. I always make a point of thanking the cashiers because God only knows the stress they're under.
Yeah.
You know, and just trying to stay safe, same as everybody else. My kid and I were playing tennis in the street yesterday, and one of our balls kind of went off into somebody's yard, and a kid came along and he was like, "I'll get it." I was like, "Don't touch it, don't touch it." And it was like, I said, "Oh, we appreciate it. You know, you're so polite. Thank you. But you know, do yourself a favor, don't touch it." You know?
Our thoughts are with you folks down there in Indy, because when we look at the map, it's scary. It's really scary. So, you know, it's stay safe, and you know, it's I've got some relatives down there as well, and I always think about them when I look at that map. So, but you know, we'll all get through this. It's just
absolutely.
But it is one of the more noted events in my lifetime and everyone's lifetime around my age. It's just different, and we all have to get together, and we'll get through it.
Well, I did tell my sons, I said, if you don't journal, start journaling and write your account of this, because this is going to be something that eventually will be in the history books, you know, or that your kids or your grandkids will say, do you remember this? You know, I mean, and it won't be that long. I mean, when you stop and think about it, my youngest son was only 4 when 9/11 happened. You know, so he still kind of relies on my memory of that because his was so shaky because he was so little.
Right.
But, you know, so you know, make a point of writing down what it's like, you know, because eventually somebody's going to do a report on it, or somebody will write a book about it like me and say, you know, and need some accounts. You know?
Well, it is going to be interesting. We'll see what life is like after this. But at any rate, that's all I had to say. Kelly?
Thanks again, Julie, so much for being on. I am absolutely going to be following your career and ordering some more books from my local bookseller, by the way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Jim will be glad to hear you say that.
Oh, yeah. Jim will be very happy to hear me say that, for sure. All right. Thank you, Julie. We appreciate you.
No problem. Thank you.
And we'll say goodbye for now. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
This episode of The Bill and Callie Show is brought to you by Tiger Plumbing. Whether you need to replace a faucet, overhaul your sump pump, or desludge your drains, call Tiger Plumbing. In today's world, knowing who's at your door is important. Tiger Plumbing sends you your technician's photo, estimated time of arrival, and a little bit about him or her. Hey, Sam likes fishing and camping. Cool.